back. This is the political point on Morning Express. Just 7 days to the planned swearing in of Raila Odinga and Kalonzo Musyoka by the opposition coalition NASA. It is a focus of our discussion in studio here this morning. Let me just introduce my panelists in studio once again. We have Professor George Wajakoya, who is a lawyer. We also have Kioko Ndugwi, who is a governance expert. Next to him is Dr. Linda Musumba, who is an advocate. And last but not least, Dr. Tom Kabau, who is an advocate and governance expert. I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Musumba. We've heard a lot from politicians with regard to the planned swearing in on the 30th of this month. Kalonzo Musyoka had a direct appeal to the president to initiate dialogue before the end of this month or kutaharibika, and those were his exact words. And we've heard from other members of NASA who seem to think that after the swearing in, then they will be able to make legislation, they will be able to take on the instruments of power, and many questions lie there as to what do the next 7 days mean for the country, and is this planned swearing in something the country needs to discuss with such urgency?
Thank you, Michelle. I think for starters, I would say that we don't quite understand very well how the people's assemblies are going to operate, or how, what space they occupy exactly in our political landscape. Having said that, the existence of this, I think there are 15 people's assemblies, is actually testimony to the fact that not everything can be legislated upon. We know the Constitution as well as the governance structure that it articulates. We know from the three arms of government and which structures underlie each of them. However, NASA has come up with the idea of having a People's Assembly that operates outside of what we know to be in the Constitution. So it's to say that there's a level at which the law cannot reach or penetrate. That people can have a structure that is outside of the Constitution, it operates, and then even gains momentum and even is able to create change or chaos for that matter. We've seen this many a time in history where, for example, if you remember in Rwanda, they said that the forces that came in, of course, to stop the genocide and everything were those of Kagame organized in exile. So people can organize themselves in exile, can organize themselves within the country despite the existence of a structure. However, one has to ask the question whether that is a situation that would be suitable for the country, whether it's going to promote the sort of conducive environment that is required for people to go about their daily lives in a way that is, peaceable and sustainable. So if it's a question of what people can do anything. The question is it what people do in terms of if there's no dialogue, dialogue could take place or it may not. But the consequence of there not being a meeting of minds over these issues that are going on in our political landscape is to say that in the next 7 days, perhaps if the swearing in will take place, we've been informed by the Jubilee government that if Raila is sworn in, they will take action in line with what the law permits them to, whereas NASA have said that we don't care, we're ready to die, for what we believe in. The question then remains for the rest of us who are ordinary citizens, what will become of us? So, because of the sake of the 40 million Kenyans who are not politicians and don't occupy direct political posts, they don't occupy spaces in government where they would be protected in case of anything, it's absolutely important that I mean to be very clear and specific on this, it's absolutely important that a dialogue does take place that is able to chart forward a course that we are all able to live in this country as stakeholders, we're all stakeholders, in a way that allows us to go about our business in peace.
Right. Ndugwi, according to critics, the country is fast moving towards the direction of a civil war with the talks of people's assemblies, swearing in of opposition leaders, and the elusive dialogue that has been preached in the country pretty much for the past, 1 year or so. What does the formation of these people's assemblies mean, even from the will of the people themselves? The fact that 15 county assemblies have already passed this motion, the fact that more than 150 members of parliament have signed affidavits to support the swearing in of Raila Odinga on the 30th of this month.
Well, it surprises me because the first key question is the swearing in of the NASA fraternity going to solve our problems? What purpose does it serve other than chaos? What other results can we get? So the solution that we are looking for is not to be found where we are looking for it. Because the issue is, as I said right from the beginning, we have a societal economic imbalance problem. And that is the key. So if we could be looking for a solution to economic imbalance, then everybody will feel included. And that is why we are having so many petitions. That is why allegations of stolen elections come after every election, and we get deeper and deeper into the problem. My purpose for being here is actually to tell Kenyans that what we need is to dialogue, but on the right things. The right things are, let there be a supplemental economic policy which supplements the effort of the existing economic policy, which will take Raila, Kalonzo, and everybody on board, alongside what exists already. The purpose for my being here is to tell Kenyans, the NASA fraternity especially, and also the government, that there is a solution to the problem that we are pursuing. It is an economic problem, and the Dugu innovation is a marketing innovation which enables every Kenyan, as you buy an item, you are afforded a retainer incentive. And the cumulative accrual of those retainer incentives are invested in county business corporations. Those county business corporations will themselves set up the county economic hub, on having many of them coming up with the county economic hub. The 47 county economic hubs will create the national economic devolution sector. That is where the crux of the matter is. Those national business corporations will offer dividends, will pay dividends to every Kenyan, so that those who feel left out are now brought on board.
All right. All right. So that's a completely different model because Ndugu continues to maintain that the problem here is an economic problem, and even NASA is swearing will not solve the problem. We'll get back to that. But Professor Wajakoya, Dr. Musumba, as clearly stated earlier, that NASA decided to go for something or to opt for a solution that is deemed outside the Constitution. But that being said, we're still using the court process, as has been warned by the likes of Kriegler. Last year we had the High Court in Kitui, barring the formation of people's assemblies, and currently we have the Attorney General, Githu Muigai, just yesterday, who moved to court again to stop the formation of people's assemblies. What do you make of these legal injunctions, and is it the right approach to get NASA to stop the formation of people's assemblies?
I think I would agree seriously with what my colleague has said, Linda Musumba, on the issues that are outside the Constitution. I will add a footnote by saying that they're actually within the Constitution. And the Constitution is very clear. It is here with me, if you may allow me, to read the preamble in conjunction with Article 174, if my colleagues can verify that as the truth. The Constitution's preamble says, the preamble first of all says, acknowledging the supremacy of the Almighty God and creation. That comes on top. The second that comes in are the people themselves, where they say that exercising our sovereign and inalienable right to determine the form of governance, of our country, and having participated fully in the making of this Constitution, preamble puts God first, the people of Kenya second, and the Constitution under the people of Kenya, which means it's a document that has the wealth of ideas by Kenyans which can be changed by them. Now, going a step down, they say, the same Constitution says, in Article 1, sovereignty of the people may exercise their sovereign power either directly or through their democratically elected representatives. Democratically elected representatives. They don't say parliament or county government. And then that actually goes further in 3.4, which says that the sovereign power of the people is exercised at the national level and the county level. Now, to qualify it, we go to Article 174, 175, and I'll read a little bit of it to enlighten myself and probably those who are listening. 134 says, which is chapter 11 of the Constitution, devolved government. 137 to 74, the objects of devolution. To promote democratic and accountable exercise of power, to foster unity by recognizing diversity, and finally, to give powers of self-governance to the people and enhance the participation of the people in the exercise of the powers of the state and in making decisions affecting them. That law gives the people's assemblies the rights to do as they want, because the Constitution is clear.
When you began, you said democratically elected leaders. Isn't that done through an election?
Yeah, but democratically elected leaders come under the Constitution. Because the people saying what they want to say. Democratically elected leaders in Parliament and in the county government. Democratically elected people within the people. I can choose to elect you, or I can choose to ignore you if I want to, But let me go to the point. Now, when it comes to the Attorney General and the courts coming up to stop what is the will of the people, then that interrogation cannot stand, because they are putting what you call prior restraint on the mindset of the people. Now, the Attorney General is coming out now to use the courts, to stop the people from what is actually constituted in the Constitution. Finally, issues of democratic governance have been seen to come from different mindsets. Probably the Kenyan system is also another way of bringing in a revolution of some kind. Right. To revolutionize the ideas of the people by telling the very, very people that they were elected that we can now listen to you, or we can stop listening to you, but you cannot put what you call prior restraint on me. And yeah.
All right. Let me come to you, Dr. Kabau. The conversation now from Jubilee, of course, remains, with its standpoint that swearing in Raila Odinga and Kalonzo would be treason, and they will take action as per the law. But the division within NASA now is whether to swear in, whether to dialogue before the swearing in, or whether to dialogue with Jubilee after the swearing in. Both would have very different consequences, considering the swearing in would have its own implications. Where would that leave the country in the case of each scenario, from a governance point of view?
If I go to the issue of first, if the swearing is done first, it is questionable because this swearing in, it is actually based on that the assemblies represent the will of the people. But again, and in a way, replying to what Professor Wajakoya was saying, when the sovereignty belongs to the people, yes, and they exercise it directly or indirectly through elected leaders. Right. But when they exercise it directly is when they elect the leaders. Of course, there are those constituent theories that of some legal philosophers such as Carl Smith, that the constituent power of the people, etc., to make the constitution, to change the constitutional order, etc. But what we have now is a very liberal constitution, which has even provisions whereby people exercise that constituent power. For instance, there are those changes which the constitution accepts that it can even be replaced, but a referendum will be required. Right. That constituent power will be whatever. Now, then come to that aspect. And it's on that basis, therefore, why I said that there lacks a constitutional basis for that swearing in. And therefore, it raises some fundamental questions. One, that where will it take place? Right. Because I don't think the government will wait for it to take in public. Probably, and the security mechanisms. Why? Because the government also has a responsibility to protect security and order. All right. And it will affect everyone, both in the opposition. If there's insecurity and anarchy, It is not on one side. It will affect both sides, whether it's Jubilee, whether it is NASA. However, suppose then it takes place. There are two things that can happen again on that. Of course, it might be difficult to assume office, to have the instruments of power, to run the affairs of government by the opposition. So that is difficult because they don't have those, the institutional framework to support that. But two, there can also be the issue of, say, anarchy. And again, then, therefore, the question is whether the government will be effective in the government currently in power in addressing that insecurity. But the third thing, which is also a risk to NASA, a very big risk, is suppose it fails. Suppose, because there will be difficulty in having a public swearing in, for sure. But that one I can't foresee, but that's my opinion. But suppose even it is done privately and whatever, what the political capital expected out of it, there's risk that it might not occur, which can also now be able to push for dialogue where NASA has a bigger stake in the negotiations. Therefore, then I come also to this other context before that swearing in happens. Suppose there's dialogue. And I would say probably, even from the Jubilee side, they should be more accommodating. And also, again, from the NASA side. And I somehow suspect that as we go towards 30th January, somehow, probably, these two sides will be more accommodating, and they will face the realities and the risks we are facing as a country. Because these continued political tensions are not good for the economy, are not good for investors, especially foreign investors. And we cannot really grow as a country without a lot of confidence by foreign investors to come and invest here. So I have a feeling that what we probably will have eventually, we might have dialogue, and with both sides coming closer to the middle. Of course, they have started from the extremes, but as we go towards that, there's a chance. Because despite us having a constitution, because one of the reasons we are having these agitations for the swearing in and alternatives, extra-constitutional governance structures, like through the People's Assemblies, is that feeling of exclusion. And that's why I said, and I differ a bit, that our problem is purely economic. Some people who are doing very well still want political power, and that's why we have so much agitation and court cases, even from the very low levels, not just presidential, but even to the MCA level. I think we need increasingly, because we started by the current constitution we have, having a framework of more inclusion.
All right.
But we need to develop further and perfect now what brings more of political inclusion, so that at the very top, especially when it comes to the governance of the country, we don't have so much high elements of feeling of exclusion and ethnicity. All
right, let's move on to something else because we don't have much time. Speaking of inclusion and exclusion, Dr. Musumba, this is just right for you. The 2/3 gender rule has now seen women take to the streets once again, really protesting over, being left out in a major leadership position, and especially within the cabinet setup. President Uhuru Kenyatta has already named 9 of his cabinet appointees, and out of those, none of them is a woman, and this has seen women groups go up in arms. The previous cabinet, of course, did not attain the 2/3 gender rule. What would it mean for the country and the president's legacy if this cabinet does not attain the same?
Thank you, Michelle. But just before I answer that, permit me, please, to make one point. I just want also to be able to, I had earlier on said that the People's Assemblies are structures which are not within, I want to clarify that, yeah? Obviously, there is nothing in the Constitution that spells out people's assemblies, explicitly. But then people organize themselves in different ways. Right. For example, the Chama movement in our country, women belong to Chamas all over the country. And through those Chamas, which you will find across the country, they have done a lot to lift up the economic status of women. So these are, you know, movements which currently there's no law that, you know, under which chamas are, you know, if they wish to be registered, they could, but there are many that are not registered. So it's a movement that exists for the purposes of lifting people's economic status. So can we have a movement that is there for political purposes, e.g. through the People's Assemblies? That is possible.
Right.
But with the People's Assemblies, through that forum, and you don't have the instruments of power, like Dr. Kabau said, what can you achieve? To what extent can you achieve what you wish if you don't have the instruments of power? Coming to your question, the president has named part of the cabinet. I want to assume in his favor that the balance of persons who are going to be named to the cabinet, that the 2/3 gender criteria is going to be respected. Of course, in the previous, cabinet it was not, rather. But I'm hoping that, in the balance of persons who will be named, that it will. In terms of a legacy of, it's very, very important that we have at the highest level in this country, i.e. the level of the presidency, that the occupant of the office abides by the law.
Right.
Because when you have the law not being abided with at that level of the presidency, then if you cascade it downwards, then you're going to find incidences of failure to abide with what is a very clear stipulation of the Constitution. So not abiding with that particular criteria, for me, will set a very bad trend for the rest of the 5 years, of which, of course, we've had the president, say that he wishes to be able to leave a very solid legacy. So, and they're competent women. It's not that. It would be a very different, thing if we say that there are no women who are competent to occupy these offices. They are there. So the question would be, why would we favor men, even to the extent of breaking the law, instead of putting these women who are competent and capable in these positions?
Right. And women groups now seem to feel that the president is perpetuating the culture of marginalization against women in the country. Where do you stand on the 2/3 gender rule?
Well, it is not proper for women to be sidelined. I wouldn't want my daughter, my wife, to be sidelined when she is qualified. And the law says women should be taken on board. It's a mistake, and I hope it's not going to be repeated for the second time in the cabinet this time.
All right. Wajakoya, already as it is, I mean, the National Assembly is 44 women short of attaining the 2/3 gender rule. Senate, about 2 women short of attaining the same. We're yet to see from the cabinet, but even the fate of the 5 women in the previous cabinet still remains unknown. This is after a Supreme Court order really directing that this should be progressive implementation of this 2/3 gender rule. How much longer until women are incorporated into these leadership positions without crying on the streets every day?
First of all, I have to thank George Weah and the people of Liberia of electing a woman vice president. And I also have to thank Liberians for having been patriotic of electing a woman president. Right. Thirdly, a lot of people do not know the concept of creation. God created man, and out of man, a woman was created. But that woman was created for a special role, to be the second creator to God. It is through that woman that we actually take refuge in her stomach for 9 months. The emotions that come with pregnancy is only a mother that knows. It is after giving birth that, again, we have to TT our mothers by putting marks on their breasts, by crying out to them. That task is also very fundamental, part of the creation. And then when we are growing up, we grow up with our mothers. I'm a victim of a woman because my mother was divorced and I became a street boy in this town. And I've been crying for mothers from the time I was born. Men should not make law to apportion some kind of responsibility to the women. They should allow women to come in and say, we want this. Reparation is key. Right. Even the American Constitution came up with reparation to draw back to the time when men were in power for that and then come in and say, now it's time for women also to get this. As a matter of fact, women should be given compensation by way of being given handouts and welfare, especially and particularly those who are not employed, but they are pregnant, they should get state benefit.
Right.
Now, when it comes to power sharing, they should be, the 2/3 gender rule is actually discriminatory. It should not be there in the first place. It would be 50-50 or 60 for women and 40 for men.
All right, and that's an interesting take. I mean, I bet women activists are watching will be very interested to speak to Professor Wajakoya. But let me get your thoughts on this, Dr. Kabau, considering that we already have Rwanda that is setting a very good example for the Eastern African region.
I also am in full support, and I have the feeling that the tide needs to turn faster.
Right.
We need more equitable representation of the female gender in both the appointive and elective posts. Of course, some of those positions, especially in relation to representation in the Senate and Parliament, etc., might require legislation. But it is the good thing to do. Even at the family level, the mother and our sisters have very important critical roles that they play. And when we do this, even at the national level, we'll be supporting economic empowerment, social empowerment in many aspects. And from the family level to the national level. And in that sense, this aspect of exclusion of the female gender is not helpful, because there are certain aspects that we might, the system might not be addressed appropriately with an inequitable representation of the female gender.
Right.
So there are certain benefits. There's always a saying I've come across that when, for instance, that when you educate a woman or when you empower a woman, you empower the whole family.
Community.
And that, when we say family, we also go to community and, of course, to the nation.
All right. And let me just pause you there. We'll continue this in just a moment. This